Welcome to the first of a series of short talks I will give covering key agreements used by the upstream oil and gas industry. This first presentation looks at gas sale and purchase agreements. I hope you find it useful. Your feedback will be most welcome. Clearly, these agreements are complex, and there are many variations worldwide, so I don't pretend to cover all possibilities. However, it is my intention to give a flavour of some of the issues that should be considered. And of course, I am happy to speak to my viewers on a one-to-one basis to give more detailed advice. My contact details appear in this presentation. I formed Black Cat Energy Services in 2007. I provide my services to the oil and gas industry globally. I have 30 years of experience, the last 8 being as a consultant working on a wide range of projects. So what's in the presentation? Today I will talk about the choice of law, contract term, quantities, take or pay, price and indexation, delivery point, delivery conditions, force majeure, default, and I will finish off with some commercial reflections. Choice of law. Clearly, it is important to listen to your lawyer's advice, but it is also clear that the choice of law must be acceptable to both buyer and seller, so it is possible that the choice of law will need to be negotiated. Around the world, legal systems can be separated into one of two types: common law or civil codes. What is important is that you make the effort to understand the subtleties of the law that you have chosen to use, especially if it isn't a legal system that you are familiar with. Whatever law you use, you also need to agree whether you will resolve disputes through the courts or use a system of arbitration. There are a number of different arbitration systems. Whatever you choose, you should consider the practicalities of how you will enforce any decision made by a court or the arbiter. In countries where gas is sold as a commodity, it is normal for the contract term to be a relatively short period, say 1 to 3 years. In other instances, the supply might be for a longer period, possibly with options for the seller to add or remove quantities depending on the performance of the supply sources. In some cases, the contract term may be for the period covered by the concession agreement or production license. The contract term might be agreed to cover the period during which hydrocarbons can be economically produced from the production sources. This requires the terms of an economic test to be defined, with allowable revenue, allowable costs, and the thresholds of the test defined. In such cases, it is normal for the source of supply to be dedicated to the contract, although there can be exceptions to this. Quantities. A key term of your agreement will be the quantity of gas to be delivered. In countries where gas is traded on a commodity exchange, it is normal for the quantities to be fixed, the logic being that seller and buyer respectively can use the marketplace to manage short or long supply positions. In other places, it is usual for the gas sales agreement to provide a mechanism for regulating the quantity of gas supplied. Your contract will state whether it is the buyer or the seller who sets the sales quantity, and whether the quantity is set on an annual, quarterly, monthly, or daily basis. Factors that apply in determining who has control are custom and practice, availability of storage, and the impact on other hydrocarbons produced in association with the gas. For example, if the gas is produced in association with crude oil, then it is common for the seller to have control of the sales quantities, so that they can maximize the production of crude oil, which is often more valuable than the gas. In the UK, prior to the introduction of a gas commodity market, it was traditional for the seller to set the annual quantities to be sold under the gas sales agreement, subject to certain rules set out in the agreement. but for the buyer to have a right to nominate the amount to be delivered on each day. This daily quantity was subject to rules that referenced the daily average rate implied by the annual quantity, along with a swing factor set out in the agreement. This in effect turned the gas supply contract into a form of gas storage, as gas could be stored in the contract and drawn down whenever needed. The buyer had a take-or-pay obligation, and that referenced the annual quantity. I will talk about take-or-pay obligations in the next slide. However, worldwide there are many different models for setting quantities, and they all work perfectly well. Take-or-pay. It is common for gas sales agreements giving flexibility of offtake to the buyer to oblige the buyer to take and pay for a minimum quantity of gas over a defined period. If the buyer takes less than this minimum quantity, they must pay for the shortfall. This provides certainty of income to the seller and gives an incentive to the buyer to offtake the minimum quantity specified in the agreement. This is important if the seller has borrowed money in order to pay for the seller's facilities and needs a certain cash flow out of which to pay the lenders. In some cases, the buyer is given a credit for the amount of gas paid for but not taken, and can subsequently recover these credits when certain conditions are satisfied. The conditions that entitle a refund of credits vary from contract to contract, but typically the buyer must take the minimum annual quantity in a subsequent period, and thereafter credits can be recovered. In some contracts, credits are obtained free, but in other contracts the buyer must pay a fee for each unit of gas recovered via these credits. Often, the buyer must recover the credits within a defined period or the credits are lost. Managing its take-or-pay position is a major occupation for a buyer. There are many variations to how these rules operate, reflecting customer practice and the strength of negotiating position of buyer and seller when the agreements were agreed. Price and indexation. As important as the rules determining the quantities to be supplied are the contractual terms surrounding the price and possibly price indexation. If the gas sales agreement is for a short term, it may be that the price is fixed for the duration of the contract term. In other cases, the price might be allowed to vary. Where there is a gas commodity market, it may be that the price under the gas sales contract will refer to the price of gas traded on the commodity market. An alternative is for the price under the gas sales agreement to be determined by reference to another form of indexation. The indexation may refer to some measure of inflation, or it may refer to alternative energy prices, such as the oil price. In some instances, a complicated basket of indices may be used. Indexation can be relatively simple, or can be made more complex by using floors and ceiling, where the gas price determined from the indexation is not allowed to fall below the floor level or above the ceiling level. In some cases, the indexation can be made horribly complex, with the floor and ceiling levels themselves being determined from indexation. Delivery point. An important term of the gas sales agreement is the definition of the point where the sale takes place. This is where the risk and reward in the gas changes from the seller to the buyer. It is normal for a meter of some description to be installed at or close to the delivery point. The gas sales agreement will define the standard to which gas being delivered is measured, and will set out rules for dealing with measurement errors. Often fiscal authorities will specify minimum standards of measurement. The seller will have obligations to deliver at the delivery point, and the buyer will have obligations to receive at the delivery point. It is very common for an individual supply to be delivered as part of a commingled stream, and there can be multiple suppliers with multiple buyers all delivering and receiving gas at the same delivery point. In such cases, it is necessary to allocate deliveries between sellers and buyers. A complexity not always realized is that the allocation to sellers may not be the same as the allocation to buyers, with the difference between the two possibly being a form of substitution. The sellers will have obligations to install and maintain the seller's facilities, and in some cases the buyer will have matching obligations to install and maintain the buyer's facilities. Delivery conditions. Natural gas is not a homogeneous product. It is comprised of a range of hydrocarbons delivered in a gaseous phase, typically consisting of methane, propane and butane. To ensure compatibility with the buyer's facilities or other downstream systems, it is important that the natural gas delivered has a heat content that lies within an agreed range. Similarly, impurities of the natural gas, such as nitrogen, CO2 and H2S, must not exceed defined levels. The temperature and pressure of the gas must also lie within agreed ranges. It is normal for the buyer to have the right to reject gas found not to comply with the specifications. But if the buyer does accept the gas, then the seller is liable to compensate the buyer for damage to the buyer's facilities. Force majeure. Contracts are likely to provide relief to the extent a failure arises due to an act of God or some event or condition that is beyond the reasonable control of the party claiming force majeure. In contracts where one of the parties belongs to the state, such as a state-owned gas supply company, it is not unknown to have special rules to prevent that party claiming force majeure for an event or condition caused by its government. It is normal for the party claiming force majeure to be obliged to seek to resolve the force majeure condition or at least minimize its impact. It is also normal for extended periods of force majeure to give rise to the other party to have a right to terminate the gas sales agreement. Default. Default can arise in a number of ways. Typically, default can take the form of a failure by the buyer or seller to take or deliver the required quantity, or a failure to pay money to the other party when required, or a failure to maintain credit support if required to do so by the gas sales agreement, or a failure by the buyer or seller to provide or maintain their respective facilities. It is normal for the gas sales agreement to give a right to the non-defaulting party to terminate the agreement if the defaulting party fails to cure their default. It is also normal for the gas sales agreement to have a mechanism of liquidated damages if the seller fails to deliver to the buyer. Often referred to as shortfall gas, the liquidated damage is obtained by the buyer having the right to pay for gas at the shortfall price, which is discounted from the normal gas price. So far, we have looked at the contractual terms, but sometimes the best method of contractual protection is having a practical alternative to the counterparty. For example, what is the benefit from terminating the agreement if there is no alternative to the counterparty? Even in remote areas where there is no alternative buyer, it is sensible for the seller to have the engineering capability to be able to re-inject natural gas and thereby allow continued production of oil and condensate in the event that gas production is forced to cease. I hope that you have found this short presentation interesting. If you have any questions or would like to discuss a particular issue, please do not hesitate to contact me either by telephone or email. Thank you very much for listening.